You guys ready to get started? That is so great! Welcome to Project Foodie. My name is Daniel Holzman. I'm the chef and owner of the Meatball Shop restaurants in New York City. And you are here in my home kitchen in Brooklyn, New York, where we are about to cook green bean casserole. This recipe has 4 simple steps and it should take about 30 minutes. I made green bean casserole for Project Foodie because it's a dish that's worth making, but people shy away from it because it's traditionally made with canned ingredients. The reality is that it's really easy to make it with fresh ingredients and it's super delicious. So rather than shy away from something, reinvent it, refresh it, reinvigorate that tired Thanksgiving, and if you make this dish, at least there'll be one good thing at your Thanksgiving dinner to eat. First and foremost, I want to gather all of our ingredients and have everything sensibly laid out. In a restaurant, we call this mise en place. It means having everything ready at a hand's reach for when you need it. Step 1, we're going to prep all of our veggies and put a big old pot of water on to boil. The first thing that we need to do is fill our pot with boiling water. So, I'm just going to put this bad boy under the faucet. I'm going to start with hot water because based on science, hot water boils faster because it's already hot. There's some old wives' tale shenanigans out there that says that cold water boils faster and hot water freezes faster, and that is all 100% nonsense, based in no science, certainly not earth science. Whoever the person is that said that should immediately be corrected and never say it again. They're pulling your leg and they're wasting your time, people. Hot water boils faster because it's already hot. Hello. We're going to season this before we cook our green beans. However, seasoning it slows the boiling process. It actually raises the boiling temperature, and it's going to take longer to boil if you season it first. However, if it's already boiling and you add the salt, it'll continue boiling. It's a miracle of science. Basically, if you need salty water boiling, bring it to a boil first, then season it. So our water's on to boil. Next step, we're going to prep our veggies. I've got our green beans here, and you know, I've definitely sat around and plucked green beans with the family, one at a time, while we're gossiping about like Aunt Janine and Genevieve or whatever her name is. But the reality is, in a restaurant, we're in a rush. So what we do, we take our green beans, we find the little pointy ends that we want to save because we want to keep those guys nice and long and beautiful. We line them up in the same direction. And then we go like this. Pop, 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 just like you're organizing some loose leaf paper, and you use a knife and you just kind of trim it off. That is the fastest, most efficient way to trim green beans. Again, so I'm going to leave this end on, which is this kind of like nice stem end. And then I'm going to line them up in the same direction. I'm going to give them a little kind of like evening so they're all the same length and they're all there. You notice how I flip the knife over and give it like a little slide, and then we just trim them off. Because we just want to trim off the root end that's stuck to the vine. Did you know that green beans grow on vines? You did? Is that because of Jack and the Beanstalk? Green beans are in season in the late summer. Around Thanksgiving time, where a lot of us think about green bean casserole, it's a little late in the season. In the Northeast, around Thanksgiving time, often we've had the first snow, and green beans don't love being frostbitten. So after it kind of like freezes, they're not quite in their prime anymore. However, in our technologically modern times, green beans are available most of the year, and I don't think anybody would be really angry at you. I'm like a real freak about seasonality, so I only eat seasonal foods in their seasons. But I think no one would be angry at you if you like served a green bean casserole in the early spring or in the winter, except for me. I'd be severely disappointed. I have sandals on, and every single time I do that, I drop one or two pieces right on my foot. I know it's kind of like uncouth, but what I do in the restaurant, if no one's looking, is I go like this. And I just trim off both ends. Because it's so much faster, and I get so bored with trimming green beans. Did you just see me cheating? Did I admit that on camera? Did you see that? It's like a tiny bit wasteful, but like chopping green beans off takes so long. Like I love cooking. There's almost no thing that when it comes to cooking I love doing. Trimming green beans is one of those ones that really just drives me crazy. And so you're only supposed to trim one end and leave this like beautiful little thing. The truth is we're making green bean casserole. It's going to get cooked to the bejesus out of it, and it's going to be delicious. No one's going to see the ends, so I'm going to trim them off because I'm in a hustle in kind of mood. Do you feel that is wasteful? Shoot me an Instagram at It's Project Foodie and complain all about it. At least I'll know you're watching. It'll make me feel good. So next step, we're just gonna take our knife and just kind of give these guys a cut so that all of our pieces are nice and manageable. And then we can place these in our small bowl and set it aside until the water comes up to a boil and they're ready to blanch. So our green beans are nice and trimmed. We have some different size pieces here. I'm not worried about that. Again, we're making a casserole. This is all going to get kind of baked and mushed together. You're not going to really be able to see the individual beans. It's going to be nice and delicious, but I'm not overly careful. The next step is we're going to peel and slice our onion. So yellow onion. Got the root end here, and you've got the kind of flower end over here. We're going to cut a good side slice off the flower end, and we're just going to barely trim the root end so that we keep the bolster, or the thing that holds the whole onion together, intact. Then we're going to cut it in half. We're going to peel it, which is very easy to do. I'm going to cut this guy in half again. We want to slice it so that we have some nice slices, but I believe half rounds are a little bit long. So I'm going to slice it in half again, and because we left the bolster in, the whole thing's going to hold together. So slice it in half again, and because there's bolster in, you can see it really clearly there, that little bolster. Because that's there, the whole thing holds together really well, which makes it easy now to go back and slice it into kind of half-inch, half rings. Just like that. Bolster end is discarded, and again, we're going to go in half and slice. So our onions are cut, our green beans are prepped, and now we are going to slice our mushrooms. Slicing mushrooms is one of my favorite things in the world to do. Button mushrooms are grown. Oh my gosh, I almost dropped those on the floor. That would have been it for Thanksgiving. So mushrooms are one of the most fun things to slice because they're really soft and gentle, and you can kind of practice showing off and slicing fast. You can slice them very thinly. The problem is that then they kind of disintegrate, and we want some discernible pieces of mushroom. So we're going to slice them kind of similar, maybe a little thinner, maybe a third of an inch to the size that we sliced the onions. So some nice kind of third of the inch thick slices of mushroom. And if you have one of those fancy mandolins, those Japanese mandolins, this is a great thing to do with that. If you've got a Cuisinart or one of those like chopping machines that has a slicing a disc on it, that works really well. But the truth of the matter is, you can just kind of slice the mushrooms. Generally speaking, I want them to be about the same size so they cook around the same rate. But if you got a thin one or a thick one, it's going to be okay. And as far as cleaning mushrooms, you know, if these mushrooms had a lot of dirt on them or any sand, these are cultivated, so they're grown in a non-sandy environment, and all the dirt is actually sterile, so you can eat anything that you see on here and it's going to be completely fine. If you wanted to like serve them in a salad and wash them, I would wash them quickly with warm water. I would submerge them, rinse them, and then dry them. There's a thing that says you should never wash mushrooms in water. Some more of the wild mushrooms tend to be like sponges and soak up a lot of water, or they can mold if you wash them and keep them. But the truth of the matter is, button mushrooms, the best way to do it is just wash them in warm water. As we all know, warm water, the molecules move quicker, they agitate the dirt, and they make things cleaner. That's why we don't wash our hands in cold water, even though it would be cold on our hands. Wait a second, am I still talking? Because that is the end of step 1. Step 2, we're going to cook our vegetables, blanch our green beans, saute the mushrooms and onions. First and foremost, we're going to take our pan and we're just going to put it on over a high heat. We're going to add our neutrally flavored, high quality olive oil. And we're going to put our onions right in. And here's the thing. I want to sweat these onions, meaning I want to cook them without getting any color. Now, if I want to saute these onions and get a lot of color, if I want to caramelize them or caramelize the sugars, brown the sugars, I would never add any salt. I would wait until the oil is screaming hot. I would throw the onions in with no salt. I would stir them minimally, because that way they would retain their moisture on the inside, the pan would be as hot as possible, and they would get nice and browned. If I want to sweat them, meaning that I don't want to get any color, I would put them into a pan with the olive oil on the cool side, so they're not going to start to sear right away, and I would add salt early on. And by adding salt early on, what's going to happen is the moisture that's in the onions is going to draw out, and they're going to steam in their own liquid. So while those guys are starting, I'm just going to take our garlic, a couple of cloves of garlic, and we want to peel these and slice them and add them. So the easiest way to, look, I was going to say the easiest way to peel the garlic. The easiest way to peel garlic is if it just peels itself. Can you imagine that? It just came out on its own. However, if that didn't, oh my God, look at this garlic. Okay, it only happened once. That was a miracle. The easiest way to peel the garlic is using the flat side of your knife. You're going to give it a little pound, which kind of crushes it. And I don't mean like, just crushed it. I mean, it actually crushes it. But I did kind of crush it, because if my goal is to peel it, it got peeled and it got crushed. Crushing it. I don't know how old you are, but if you're a millennial, you just got that joke. If you watch The Hills, you got that joke. So we're chopping our garlic a little tiny bit, and we can throw it in with the onions. Just kind of some rough chopped pieces. This is going to get cooked for a while, so it'll break down. And I like the flavor of some like rougher chopped pieces of garlic if they've been long cooked. And we can give it a stir. If I get a tiny bit of color on here, if it's kind of like, you know, depending on how thin your pan is, it might be really, really hot. It might start to get color. You're like, oh my God, I'm starting to burn. Add a few teaspoons or a tablespoon of water in there, and that'll slow it down right away. You can always like just pull it off the fire if you're freaking out. So we can give a peek at our water here, which is, voila, boiling rapidly. And what we're going to do, once our water is boiling rapidly, is we're going to season it. We're going to put a big old handful, a full man-sized bare hand worth of salt in here, because the green beans are going to cook faster in the hotter water. Salty water does a couple things. It seasons the green beans as they cook, but it also raises the boiling temperature, which is going to cook them faster. Now, if I'm doing a green bean salad or something where I want them a little crunchy and vibrant green, that is absolutely imperative, because the longer the cook, the browner they get. In this case, however, the truth is these are going to get cooked for a long time in casserole. They're not going to be vibrant green. So the only reason to do it is just to cook them, is just to season them. So our water is boiling, it's salty. We're going to dump our green beans in and put our timer on for about 5 minutes, because I want them to be fairly soft. And then finally, I'm going to add our fresh thyme to our onions and garlic. So I got onions and garlic and some fresh thyme, a few sprigs of fresh thyme in there, and that's going to season the base. So our onions have been cooking for 4 or 5 minutes. You can see that they're just starting now to give a little bit of color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add our mushrooms. The mushrooms are like 90% water, and what's going to happen is they might sear for a second, but then they're going to steam with the onions, and the salt in the onions is going to draw out their liquid, and they're basically going to start stewing in mushroom juice. And that's all the water being pulled out of the mushrooms and falling out. And what we want to do is cook them. So again, just kind of like the onions, if I want to sear mushrooms, I want to get color on them, I need to go screaming hot in the pan, then add the oil so it's smoking, and just put enough mushrooms so I've got a single layer so they crisp up, so that any water that comes out of them boils off immediately and they don't start to stew. If I make a big old pile of mushrooms, what happens is the steam from the bottom, when it's contacting that hot oil, gets trapped in these mushrooms over the top, condenses and drips back down, and then the mushrooms start to stew in their own oil until you get a critical mass of water. The whole thing breaks down and they start to kind of like actually boil, at which point the water will boil off and then they'll start to actually dry up. So we've got our mushrooms and our onions cooking, our green beans are cooking, and we've got probably about 3 minutes before the green beans are done, and we've got about 10 minutes before the mushrooms and onions are fully cooked. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this time to pick up all the garbage I threw on the floor accidentally and pretend I didn't, like the green bean ends and the onions. This might be a good time to catch up on like a quick back episode of Project Foodie. So I don't know if you can hear what's going on, but it went from a sizzling saute to a bubbling boil. Basically, that's how we know that our onion mushrooms have dropped their liquid. So it was sauteing, meaning all of the water was evaporating immediately and it was so hot, and now the water has gotten the best of it. It's cooled the hot pan down and it can't steam off as fast as the water can be expelled from the mushrooms, and it starts boiling. You can look. See all that liquid? I mean, it's a huge amount of water in these guys. And so it's going to take a good 10 minutes for all that to boil off and evaporate, at which point we're going to hear, and our ears do a lot more work than we know when we're cooking if we let them. We're going to hear it start to go from a babbling brook of boiling mushrooms to back to a sizzling saute of sexy fungus. Our green beans have been in for just about 4.5 minutes. So I can pull one out. And our goal is, we don't want these to be crispy, but remember, we don't want them to have absolutely no texture, and we know that they're going to absolutely perfect. So 5 minutes is the perfect amount of time. We're going to drop our colander in the sink, turn off our burner, and being super duper careful because it's very hot. And a steam burn burns you worse than boiling water. So this is like a real thing, is that steam takes a huge amount of energy to jump from a liquid state to a gaseous state. almost the same amount of energy that it takes to go from 0 degrees all the way up to 100 degrees Celsius or like 32 up to 212. It takes almost that same amount of energy to jump from 212 up to 213 and go from liquid to steam. Well, when that steam hits your skin and condenses down, it releases all that energy and burns you worse than boiling water. So I'm super careful with boiling water, steaming stuff. Dry towels, stepping back. I'm just gonna carefully drop it into our colander. Woo! Free glasses cleaning, people. And normally, if I wanted these green beans to be nice and crisp and crunchy, I would immediately plunge them into ice cold water, meaning water with ice cubes in it, and cool them very quickly. That will retain their vibrant green crunchiness. However, in this case, they're gonna get stewed. They're gonna be in a casserole. I do wanna cool them down. I don't wanna just keep on cooking until they're completely mush. So I'll just rinse them under a little bit of running cold water, just to kind of take the super hot edge off. New York City tap water, 41 degrees year round. Did you know that? I didn't know that either. I still don't know that. It might not be true. But it feels like 41-ish. Could be 41. You got a thermometer? Prove me wrong at It's Project Foodie. And then we can dump them back on top of our little mixing bowl and let them continue to drain. Our mushrooms on the hand over here, you can see that most of the liquid is boiled off, so we're going to cook them a little longer. And this is a really great time to just give them a quick taste. I love to taste throughout the way I'm cooking. I think that our recipes are really well written and the seasoning is pretty perfect. However, from time to time, you know, depending upon how big your mushrooms are, or relative humidity, how salty your salt is based on the kernel size, what brand you're using, all different, what your palate's like from day to day, you might want to add a little more or a little less salt. So I think it's a really great thing to just have an idea of what you're tasting like. Oh my God, those are great. If they were way too salty, I would know that if the next stage needs salt, maybe I would hold back a little bit. I just think that like relying on a recipe is not how you learn how to cook. The way you learn how to cook is following a recipe and tasting along the way and making mental note. So our mushrooms and onions have now dropped all of their liquid and it's all boiled off. So you can see that when I pull it, all the liquid is gone, and you can hear, I got a microphone so I'm being weird, but I know you can hear me from here, but it just makes me feel better if I go like this. It's like my mom when she reads a book like this. I'm like, you can see it from over here. She's like, it's like a thing. You know what I'm saying? So our green beans have now dropped, our mushrooms and onions have now released all their liquid and it's turned off. So that is the end of step 2. Step 3, we're gonna thicken the sauce and we're gonna combine the mushroom gravy with the green beans to create a casserole. So for step 3, we're gonna turn our mushrooms and onions into that concentrated mushroom and onion soup. Green bean casserole was invented by the Campbell's Soup Company as a marketing ploy to sell more of their condensed mushroom soup. They're coming up with recipes to cook with their soups. And so green bean casserole was originally made with condensed mushroom soup and green beans, frozen or fresh, that you mix together and baked. It's a delicious recipe. So we're basically making that same recipe from scratch, meaning we are making condensed mushroom soup. And the way to do that is we're gonna take our mushrooms and our onions that have been sauteing with our thyme. They're screaming at us right now. All the moisture is out of them. We can pick the thyme stems out, which, being kind of careful, you can use a fork or tongs, but I got my asbestos chef mitts on. So you can just pull these guys out. And we're gonna add some butter, which is gonna add some flavor and richness. I'm also going to, once this is melted, add a couple of tablespoons. Now, the recipe should be the recipe and you should follow the recipe. Here's the deal. There aren't a lot of things that I'm like really specific with, but when it comes to a thickener like flour or cornstarch where the amount you put in will make it thicker or thinner, I think it's important to start with the recipe because what you don't want to do is end up with like cement soup. Does that make sense? So I almost never measure stuff unless it's a thickener, especially something like gelatin where it's like a really small amount will make a huge difference. So we put our flour in and just sprinkle it around the top. You know, if there weren't any solids in here, if I was putting flour in with a liquid, like I was thickening chicken soup, I would want to make sure that I, whisked it and poured it in really simply, or mixed it with the butter so that it melted through. Otherwise, it'll clump up. In this case, with the butter and the onions and the mushrooms, it's really not going to clump and it'll be fine. And this is basically a roux. So a roux is when I cook flour and butter together. And normally I toast it in the hot pan, and then I add, whatever else I'm going to add on top of it, the liquid. In this case, however, because we cook the mushrooms and the onions together, we're going to cook the roux in with these vegetables. And once it's all mixed, I just want to kind of toast it, giving it a little scrape for a good minute before I add the liquid. Otherwise, I end up with this raw flour flavor that I can never kind of get out. So this is when I want to kind of cook that flour and make sure it has a chance to soak in. What I do want to also monitor is that the bottom of my pan, having a little color is going to add some kind of like nice flavor to my dish. But if it's burnt, it's going to be the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to be kind of careful to cook it, scraping the bottom, but if it starts to burn, I'll add my liquid sooner than later. So this guy's been cooking here, and what we can do is we can add our milk and our heavy cream. So we can add our milk, and I do it from up on high to look extra cool. The other day I was at an Italian restaurant with an adult friend of mine, and he ordered a glass of milk with his entree, and it blew my mind. I did not understand who this human being was, where they came from, or why. I never got it. And a little bit of heavy cream. And that heavy cream is going to be for richness, and it's just going to add a ton of fat to our dish, and that fat is going to make this a really rich, delicious dish that's, for the holidays. Again, if people are like, well, I could make it with skim milk. 100% you could make this with skim milk. You could make it as healthy as you want. I don't eat to be healthy. I eat to be delicious, and then I eat less to be healthy. Or I choose my dishes based on how delicious they are, and then if I want a diet dish, I choose a diet dish, I don't try and make an unhealthy dish healthy. Does that make sense? So this is another moment here where, you want it to be creamy and you don't want it to be solid. So if, again, like the recipe should be great, but if it needs another splash of milk, depending upon how hot your pan was or how fast you're cooking it, feel free to add another splash of milk. If it doesn't thicken up, here's the deal. Flour and other thickeners don't really thicken until it comes up to a boil. That's what the flour absorbs the liquid, and it starts to distribute. It comes up to a boil it thickens once it comes up to a boil. So if it's too thin, make sure you wait for it to come up to a boil. And then if it hasn't thickened, what you can do is you can let it cook down a little bit. So you don't need to try and add more flour. If it looks something like this, if you let it cook for another minute or so, this will actually come together. So, here's what we got going on, and what I can do is I'm just going to add the rest of our salt and pepper and bring this up. And again, black pepper, freshly ground. We're going to give it a final mix. I can turn off the flame here. This is exactly how thick you want it. You see that? When I pick up the pan, it flows. When I move the pan, when I move the mushrooms and onions from side to side, they creep back together, but they don't flow back together. Does that make sense? They move back kind of slowly. And this is kind of our last chance to really kind of season this dish, so we can give it a little taste. And remember, we're going to add the green beans, so we want it to be a little too salty. A little too delicious. That is so great! Our green beans go right in, nicely drained. And So here's the deal with this. Green bean casserole should be served with crispy onions on top. So at this stage, what I would do is, if I was bringing this over to a friend's house, this is the stage that I would take it. And you could do this the night before, a couple of days before, the day of. You can cool this for a half an hour on your stovetop and then put it in your refrigerator with a lid cracked, because things cool faster with no lid on them because the heat has a chance to escape. And then cover it overnight and it'll stay in the fridge for a few days. When you're ready to serve it, you put it in the oven and you bring it back up to temperature. And then right before you serve it, after it's nice and hot, you put the crispy onions on top. So again, like if I had friends coming over to dinner, I would make this now, just like this. Looks really beautiful. And then I would kind of keep it just like this in the oven on a low temperature until I'm ready to serve, at which point I'll take it out and I'll put our Funyuns on top. In this case, because the only reason I'm making this amazing dish is for you, I'm just going to go ahead and put the onions on top. But that happens in step 4. So this is the end of step 3. Step 4, we're going to cover it in Funyuns and serve. This would be the time to decide I want to put it in a different container. So I could put it in a baking dish or whatever my presentation is. We're going to keep it in the oven and heat it back up before we do, in which case we throw it in the oven. In this case, we're serving it in this dish. We like it. It's ready to go. We're just going to transfer it over. It's a little bit warm. Be careful. Take a look. If there's anything we don't like, it's like now or never. So a final taste. So great. I lost my spoon and I got so upset, and then it was here. A final taste and reseason. And remember, if it's sat overnight, you might need to add another sprinkle of salt and give it a toss, because you need a little refresher. In this case, it's very delicious. And remember, the onions are a little bit salty. So, crispy onions. And the technique here is you want to pour the Funyuns on the casserole. So you're going to sprinkle them on just like this. And the reality is that everybody loves a Funyun. And nothing makes a casserole more fun than a Funyun. It's like an onion, except it's fun. That's why they call them Funyuns. And that, my friends, is our scratch-made, classic, American green bean casserole. Be sure to like and subscribe, check us on Instagram, and download the Project Foodie app on the iOS App Store. I hope you've enjoyed this Project Foodie cook-along, and I hope you'll join us for more. If you want to make a delicious green bean casserole from scratch, you are going to need the following ingredients. I have some green beans. These are Blue Lake green beans, which are a particular variety. They're like haricots verts, which are these thin French green beans. Those are great, but they tend to be really expensive and awesome for like blanching and serving kind of on the plate by themselves. I feel like it would be a waste to use haricots verts and then like cook them forever. Plus the Blue Lakes have a little bit more meat to them, so when you cook them for a long time, even though they're going to be really soft and tender, they'll still have some texture. Some kosher salt and black pepper, freshly ground, as they would. Some all-purpose flour, which we're going to use to thicken. Garlic and onions. Some fresh thyme, and fresh thyme is one of those ingredients that it doesn't dry well as an herb. So if you can't find fresh thyme, I would skip the herb altogether. However, fresh thyme is pretty easily found at most supermarkets, so use some fresh thyme. We have some button mushrooms. Any mushrooms will do. I love button mushrooms, actually. They're the least expensive, they're the easiest to find, and they have a great flavor. They're fun to work with, and they're traditional for this dish. A light, neutral flavored olive oil. Some unsalted butter. I prefer salted butter on my toast, but when I'm cooking, I only use unsalted butter, and then I add the salt separately. We have heavy cream, some whole milk. I'm using whole milk here because I'm putting heavy cream and butter in there. So using skim milk with heavy cream and butter would be like eating a candy bar at the dentist. It's just It just, you know what I'm saying? It cancels itself out. And finally, the most important, all the fun happens when you put the fun in Funions. Putting the fun in onions. These are called Funions. Actually, they're just called crispy onions. I don't know why I keep on calling them Funions. You could make your own fried onions. A little bit dirty. It's time consuming. Kind of smells up the house. It's the kind of thing I would do as a chef. But if I were you, since 1904, French's Funions. Come on. Let's do it, people.
Psst, Daniel, you're on.
If you want to make a classic green bean casserole, you are going to need the following tools. We have a knife and cutting board, measuring cups and measuring spoons, a tasting spoon, a colander for draining green beans, a large pot for blanching green beans, a small bowl, a wooden spoon for stirring. I love this flat wooden implement that's kind of great for scraping and stirring. And finally, I've got this pan that I love to present in. And it's perfect for this dish because we're going to saute mushrooms in it. And then we're going to mix the casserole and bake in it and present it at the table. So if you have one like this, that's amazing, something that you can do all three in. If not, you can do a regular saute pan to saute the mushrooms and onions, and then you can transfer it into a baking dish to cook and serve.